The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant William Hayes adjusted his red tunic for what would unknowingly be one of his final times. At 52, William had spent nearly 3 decades serving in the Queen's Guard, standing motionless for hours in the sweltering heat and bitter cold, protecting the royal family with unwavering dedication. His weathered hands, marked by years of gripping his rifle in ceremonial stance, trembled slightly as he fastened the brass buttons of his uniform. William's wife, Margaret, had been battling cancer for 8 months now. The treatments were expensive, and despite the healthcare system's support, the additional costs of special medications and comfort care were mounting. Their small cottage in the countryside felt emptier each day as Margaret grew weaker, and William found himself torn between his duty to the crown and his desperate desire to spend every remaining moment with the woman he had loved for 27 years. The other guards had noticed the change in William. His usually perfect posture showed slight signs of fatigue, and his eyes carried a weight that went beyond the physical demands of their role. During their brief breaks, he would often stare into the distance, lost in thoughts of medical bills and precious time slipping away. His fellow guardsmen respected him too much to pry, but they could see the internal struggle written across his lined face. That particular Tuesday morning felt different somehow. As William took his position outside the main entrance, he noticed increased activity within the castle walls. Young Prince George, now 10 years old, was visiting with his family. The boy had grown taller since William had last seen him up close, and there was something about the prince's curious, intelligent eyes that had always struck the veteran guard as remarkable. William remembered the day Prince George was born, how the entire nation had celebrated, and how proud he had felt to be part of the security detail protecting the future king. Over the years, he had watched the young prince from a distance during various ceremonies and events, always maintaining the required professional distance, but secretly admiring the boy's natural charm and genuine kindness toward everyone he met. As the morning progressed, William felt the familiar ache in his lower back, a reminder of countless hours standing at attention. But today the physical discomfort was overshadowed by the emotional turmoil churning in his chest. Margaret's latest doctor's appointment was scheduled for that afternoon, and he knew the results might determine how much time they had left together. The thought of missing even one day with her felt unbearable. Yet his sense of duty and responsibility to his position kept him rooted in place. The castle grounds buzzed with the quiet efficiency of staff preparing for the day's activities. Gardeners tended to the roses, their morning routine creating a peaceful backdrop to William's mounting anxiety. He had served through multiple royal weddings, state visits, and historic moments, but never had his personal life felt so at odds with his professional obligations. Prince George appeared in one of the upper windows, waving at the tourists gathered beyond the gates. William watched as the young boy's face lit up with genuine joy at the sight of the crowds below. There was something pure and untainted about the prince's enthusiasm that reminded William of his own grandson, whom he rarely got to see due to his demanding schedule. The weight of his rifle felt heavier than usual, as William contemplated the impossible choice before him. His pension was still several years away, and leaving his position now would mean financial uncertainty at the worst possible time. Yet every fiber of his being screamed that he should be home with Margaret, holding her hand through the difficult treatments and making the most of whatever time they had remaining. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, William steeled himself for another day of silent service, unaware that a chance encounter with the young prince would soon change everything. The morning air carried the scent of blooming flowers and the distant sound of London traffic, creating a surreal contrast to the timeless tradition he represented. His story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would touch the heart of a future king and remind everyone involved of the profound humanity that exists within the rigid structure of royal protocol. The afternoon brought an unexpected break in the usual routine when Prince George convinced his protection officer to let him walk through the gardens. The 10-year-old had always been fascinated by the guards, their perfect stillness and their unwavering dedication. Unlike many children his age, George understood the importance of their role and had developed a deep respect for the men and women who protected his family. As Prince George strolled along the garden path with his security detail maintaining a respectful distance, he noticed something different about Sergeant Hayes. The guard's usually impeccable posture seemed strained, and there was an unmistakable sadness in his eyes that the perceptive young prince couldn't ignore. George had always been remarkably empathetic for his age, a quality that both his parents and grandparents had nurtured and admired. The prince slowed his walk as he approached William's position, studying the guard's face with the innocent curiosity that only a child possesses. Most people, even adults, rarely looked directly at the guards, treating them almost like living statues. But George saw them as real people with real lives, families, and concerns beyond their ceremonial duties. William felt the prince's gaze and, despite his training to remain focused, straight ahead, he couldn't help but notice the boy's genuine interest. There was something disarming about Prince George's presence, a natural warmth that seemed to cut through the formal barriers that typically separated the royal family from their staff. The guard had seen the prince interact with others before, always polite, always considerate, but this moment felt different. Prince George whispered something to his protection officer, who initially shook his head, but then, after seeing the determination in the young prince's eyes, reluctantly nodded. The boy approached William slowly, his small hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that mimicked the formal bearing he had observed in countless official settings. Standing just a few feet away from the towering guard, Prince George looked up at William with those intelligent, compassionate eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years. The boy had noticed something that even William's fellow guards had missed, a small tear that had escaped down the sergeant's cheek, barely visible but unmistakable to someone looking closely enough. The garden around them seemed to fall silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath for this unprecedented moment. William's heart raced as he realized the prince was not simply passing by, but had stopped deliberately to observe him. Every instinct told him to maintain his rigid stance, to ignore the royal child as protocol demanded. But something in Prince George's expression suggested this was no ordinary encounter. Prince George cleared his throat softly and, in a voice barely above a whisper, asked, "Are you all right, sir?" The simple question carried such genuine concern that William felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. No one had asked him that question in weeks, and certainly not someone whose very presence commanded such respect and formality. The protection officer stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the breach of protocol, but Prince George raised a small hand to indicate he should wait. The boy's maturity in that moment was remarkable, showing an understanding of both his position and his humanity that belied his young age. William's throat tightened as he struggled to maintain his professional demeanor while processing the kindness being shown to him by this remarkable child. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither the guard nor the prince fully understood at that moment. Here was the future King of England, showing more personal concern for a single guard than most people showed for their closest neighbors. The afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oak trees, casting dappled shadows on the garden path where this extraordinary scene was unfolding. Time seemed suspended as William wrestled with how to respond to such an unexpected display of royal compassion. Prince George waited patiently, his small frame radiating a calm confidence that seemed to give William permission to be human, to acknowledge the pain he had been carrying alone for so many months. The boy's simple question had opened a door that William hadn't even realized existed, creating a bridge between duty and humanity that would change both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. William's voice caught in his throat as he fought between his trained instincts and the overwhelming urge to respond honestly to the young prince's question. The weight of nearly 30 years of service, combined with the crushing worry about his wife's condition, suddenly felt unbearable. For the first time in his career, Sergeant Hayes found himself on the verge of breaking protocol in the most fundamental way possible. "Your Highness," William began, his voice barely audible. He stopped himself, remembering his position, his duty, and the consequences of speaking out of turn. But Prince George's patient, understanding expression encouraged him to continue. The boy stepped closer, showing no concern for the breach of formal distance that his action represented. Prince George had always been taught about the sacrifices made by those who served his family. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had instilled in him a deep appreciation for the dedication of every person who worked to maintain the monarchy's traditions and security. But this was the first time he was seeing that sacrifice up close, written plainly across the face of a man who had given his life to protecting others. "My wife is very sick," William whispered, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The doctors say. He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Prince George's young face immediately filled with understanding and sympathy that seemed far beyond his years. The protection officer stepped forward again, clearly concerned about the unusual nature of this interaction, but Prince George held up his hand once more. The boy had inherited his great-grandmother's ability to command respect through presence rather than force, and even the experienced security professional recognized the authority in that small gesture. "I'm very sorry to hear that," Prince George said softly, his words carrying a sincerity that touched William's heart. "It must be very difficult for you to be here when you want to be with her." The prince's emotional intelligence was remarkable, immediately grasping the core conflict that was tearing William apart. William felt tears welling up in his eyes as he nodded slightly, abandoning his rigid posture for the first time in decades while on duty. The relief of being understood, of having his struggle acknowledged by someone who genuinely cared, was overwhelming. He had been carrying this burden alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone else recognize his pain. Prince George looked around the garden thoughtfully, his young mind processing the situation with surprising maturity. He had been raised to understand that his position came with both privileges and responsibilities, and he was beginning to realize that one of those responsibilities was to care for the people who cared for his family. "What's your wife's name?" the prince asked gently, his question showing a level of personal interest that caught William completely off guard. In all his years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him about his personal life, not because they were unkind, but because the formal structure of their relationship typically prevented such intimate conversations. "Margaret," William replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Margaret, and we've been married for 27 years. The simple act of saying her name aloud to someone who cared enough to ask felt like a small miracle. Prince George nodded solemnly, committing the name to memory with the same care he gave to his studies and official duties. "Margaret," he repeated softly as if testing how the name felt on his tongue. "That's a beautiful name. I bet she's very proud of you for serving our family for so long." The observation hit William like a physical blow, because it captured exactly what Margaret had always said. Even as she grew sicker, even as the treatments drained her strength, she had continued to express pride in his service, his dedication, and his unwavering loyalty to the crown. But now, faced with losing her, that pride felt meaningless compared to the precious time they were losing. Prince George seemed to sense the depth of William's internal struggle. The boy's natural empathy, combined with his growing understanding of leadership and responsibility, was creating a moment of connection that transcended their vastly different positions in life. Here was a future king learning one of the most important lessons of leadership, that true strength comes from caring for those who serve you. Prince George stood quietly for a moment, his young mind working through the complexity of the situation before him. The boy had always been taught that actions spoke louder than words, and he could see that Sergeant Hayes needed more than just sympathy. The prince's natural instinct to help others, carefully nurtured by his parents and grandparents, was telling him that this moment required something special. "Sergeant Hayes," Prince George said formally, using William's name for the first time, which caused the guard to look down at him in surprise. "How long have you been protecting my family?" The question seemed simple, but William could sense there was a deeper purpose behind it. 29 years, Your Highness," William replied, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his service record. "I started when I was 23, just after your grandfather was born. I've been here through celebrations, difficult times, and everything in between." Prince George's eyes widened with genuine amazement. 29 years, he repeated, as if trying to comprehend the enormity of such dedication. "That means you've been protecting us since before I was even born, since before my father was married, since before so many important things happened in our family." William nodded, feeling a surge of pride despite his current emotional state. Those 29 years represented a lifetime of service, of missed family dinners, holidays spent on duty, and countless personal sacrifices made in the name of royal protection. But hearing Prince George acknowledge that service with such respect and understanding made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. The young prince began walking slowly around William, not in a way that felt disrespectful, but with the careful observation of someone trying to understand something important. You've probably seen more of our family's history than most people, George continued thoughtfully. You've been there for moments that will be in history books someday. The protection officer was growing increasingly nervous about the unusual nature of this conversation, checking his watch and glancing toward the castle as if expecting someone to come looking for the prince. But Prince George seemed completely absorbed in his interaction with the guard, showing no interest in ending their conversation. Your wife Margaret must have made many sacrifices too, Prince George observed with startling insight. Being married to someone who protects us means she had to share you with our family all these years, like the boys. Understanding of the broader implications of William's service was remarkable for someone his age. William felt his composure crack further as he realized how perfectly the young prince had captured the reality of his marriage. Margaret had indeed sacrificed countless evenings, weekends, and holidays supporting his career while building a life around his unpredictable schedule. She had been proud of his service, but she had also paid a price for it. She has, Your Highness, William admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She's always understood that serving your family was important to me. But now when she needs me most. He couldn't finish the sentence, but Prince George understood perfectly. The boy stopped walking and stood directly in front of William again, his small hands clasped behind his back in that formal gesture that somehow made him seem older and more authoritative. Sergeant Hayes, he said with a gravity that seemed impossible for a 10-year-old. I think my family owes you and Margaret more than just thanks. William was confused by the statement, unsure what the prince meant, but there was something in the boy's tone that suggested he was forming a plan. Prince George had always been taught that leadership meant taking care of the people who took care of you. And he was beginning to understand that this was one of those moments when leadership required action, not just words. I want to meet her, Prince George announced suddenly, his decision clearly made. I want to meet Margaret and thank her personally for sharing you with us for all these years. The suggestion was so unexpected, so far outside the normal bounds of royal protocol, that both William and the protection officer stared at the prince in stunned silence. The implications of such a visit were staggering. Members of the royal family, especially young Prince George, didn't simply visit the homes of staff members. The security arrangements alone would be complicated, not to mention the breach of traditional boundaries between the royal family and their employees. But Prince George seemed completely serious about his proposal, his young face set with determination that William recognized as unmistakably royal. The protection officer immediately stepped forward, his professional instincts kicking in at the prince's unexpected announcement. Your Highness, I'm not sure that would be possible, he began diplomatically. But Prince George turned to face him with a look of quiet determination that was unmistakably royal. Why not? The prince asked simply, his question carrying the weight of someone who was already beginning to understand the power of his position. Sergeant Hayes has spent nearly 30 years protecting my family. If we can't take one afternoon to properly thank him and his wife, then what kind of people are we? William watched this exchange with growing amazement. The 10-year-old prince was displaying a level of moral clarity and leadership that many adults never achieved. There was something profound happening here, something that went far beyond a child's simple desire to help someone in need. The protection officer was clearly struggling with how to respond. On one hand, his job was to protect Prince George and maintain appropriate boundaries. On the other hand, he was witnessing something remarkable, a future king learning to use his privilege in service of others rather than just for his own benefit. Your Highness, the officer tried again. There would be security concerns, protocol issues, and your parents would need to approve such a visit. He was clearly hoping that the mention of parental approval would end the discussion, but Prince George simply nodded as if he had already considered these obstacles. Then we'll ask them, the prince replied matter-of-factly. My grandmother always taught me that true leadership means taking care of the people who serve you. Sergeant Hayes and Margaret have served our family for almost 30 years. It's time we served them back. William felt tears flowing freely down his cheeks now, no longer caring about maintaining his stoic facade. The young prince's words had touched something deep in his heart. A part of him that had begun to believe that his years of sacrifice had gone unnoticed and unappreciated. Prince George noticed William's tears and, without hesitation, reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, clean handkerchief. He offered it to the guard with a gentle smile that somehow managed to preserve William's dignity, even in this vulnerable moment. "Please don't cry, Sergeant Hayes," the prince said softly. "You've been taking care of us for so long. Let us take care of you and Margaret now." The simple statement carried such sincerity and compassion that William had to steady himself against his rifle to keep from falling to his knees. The protection officer was speaking quietly into his radio, presumably informing his superiors about the unusual situation developing in the garden. Prince George paid no attention to these logistical concerns, his focus entirely on the man before him, who had dedicated his life to royal service. "Will you tell me about Margaret?" Prince George asked, settling himself on a nearby garden bench and patting the space beside him in invitation. "I want to know about the woman who has been sharing her husband with my family for all these years." William looked around nervously, unsure whether sitting with the prince would be appropriate, but George's encouraging nod convinced him to abandon protocol once again. As he carefully lowered himself onto the bench, William realized that this was the first time in his entire career that he had ever sat in the presence of a member of the royal family. "She's the kindest person I've ever known," William began, his voice growing stronger as he talked about his beloved wife. "She became a teacher because she wanted to help children learn and grow. Even now, when she's so sick, she still asks about the students she had to leave behind when the treatment started." Prince George listened intently, his young face serious and focused as William shared stories about Margaret's generosity, her strength, and her unwavering support throughout his career. The boy asked thoughtful questions, showing genuine interest in learning about this woman who had played such an important role in supporting someone who protected his family. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the garden, Prince George made a decision that would change everything. "Sergeant Hayes," he said with the quiet authority of someone born to leadership, "I'm going to speak with my parents today. Margaret shouldn't have to worry about anything except getting better, and you shouldn't have to choose between your duty to us and your love for her." That evening, Prince George sat in the drawing room with his parents, Prince William and Catherine, his usual playful demeanor replaced by a seriousness that immediately caught their attention. The boy had been unusually quiet during dinner, clearly processing something important, and now he was ready to share what was on his mind. "Mummy, Daddy," he began formally, using the tone he reserved for serious discussions, "I need to tell you about something that happened today, and I need your help with something very important." His parents exchanged glances, recognizing the gravity in their son's voice. Prince William leaned forward, giving his son his full attention. "What is it, George? You seem very concerned about something." The prince had always encouraged his children to come to him with their problems, but there was something different about George's demeanor tonight. Prince George took a deep breath and began to recount his encounter with Sergeant Hayes, describing the guard's obvious distress, their conversation about Margaret's illness, and his own growing understanding of the sacrifices made by the people who served their family. His parents listened in amazement as their 10-year-old son demonstrated a level of empathy and leadership that filled them with pride. "So you see," George concluded, "Sergeant Hayes has protected us for 29 years, but now he needs our protection. His wife is dying and he's torn between his duty to us and his love for her. That's not fair, is it?" The question was posed with such innocent clarity that it cut straight to the heart of the matter. Catherine reached over and took her son's hand, her eyes shining with pride at his compassion. "George, what you did today was remarkable. The way you noticed Sergeant Hayes's pain and took the time to listen to him shows incredible kindness and wisdom." Prince William nodded in agreement, but there was also concern in his expression. "Son, you're absolutely right that we owe Sergeant Hayes and his wife more than we can ever repay. But there are complicated protocols and procedures involved in how we interact with our staff. We can't simply ignore those systems, but why not?" Prince George asked with the directness that only children possess. "If the protocols prevent us from helping good people when they need us most, then maybe the protocols are wrong." His parents were struck silent by the profound simplicity of their son's logic. The family discussed the situation for over an hour, with Prince George passionately arguing for immediate action, while his parents explained the complexities of royal protocol and security requirements. But gradually, as the conversation continued, Prince William and Catherine began to see the situation through their son's eyes. "What exactly are you proposing we do?" Prince William asked, already sensing that his son had a specific plan in mind. Prince George's face lit up with excitement as he outlined his ideas. "First, we visit Margaret to thank her properly for sharing her husband with us. Second, we make sure she gets the best medical care available without them having to worry about money. And third, we give Sergeant Hayes permission to spend as much time with her as she needs without losing his job or pension." The proposals were delivered with such earnest conviction that neither parent had the heart to immediately point out the logistical challenges involved. Instead, they found themselves caught up in their son's vision of using their privilege to genuinely help people who had served them faithfully. Catherine was the first to speak. "George, your heart is in exactly the right place, and your instincts about helping Sergeant Hayes are correct. But we need to find ways to help that don't compromise security or create problems for other staff members who might need similar help in the future." Prince William was already thinking practically about how such assistance might be arranged. "We could certainly ensure that Margaret receives excellent medical care, and we could definitely arrange for William to have more flexible duties during this difficult time. As for visiting her personally—" "Please, Daddy," Prince George interrupted, his young voice carrying a note of urgency. "She's been sharing her husband with us for almost 30 years. The least we can do is spend one afternoon telling her how grateful we are. If we don't do this, how can we ever ask anyone else to serve our family knowing that we won't be there for them when they need us most?" The question hung in the air, challenging everything Prince William and Catherine thought they knew about the boundaries between the royal family and their staff. Their 10-year-old son was teaching them a lesson about leadership that they had never learned in any formal training, and they were beginning to realize that he might be absolutely right. 3 days later, William Hayes received an unprecedented phone call from the palace. The conversation was brief but life-changing. Prince George, accompanied by his parents, would be visiting Margaret that afternoon to personally thank her for her years of supporting William's service to the crown. The security arrangements had been quietly handled, and medical specialists were already being arranged to ensure Margaret received the best possible care. When the royal car pulled up outside their modest cottage, William could hardly believe what was happening. Margaret, despite her weakness from recent treatments, had insisted on sitting in her favorite chair by the window, wearing her best dress and the pearl necklace William had given her on their wedding day. Her face, though pale and thin, glowed with an excitement he hadn't seen in months. Prince George was the first to enter their small living room, his natural confidence helping to ease the overwhelming formality of the moment. He walked directly to Margaret's chair and, with a maturity that belied his young age, took her frail hand gently in both of his. "Mrs. Hayes," he said softly, "I'm Prince George, and I came here to thank you personally for something very important." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked at this remarkable child who had traveled to her home simply to acknowledge her sacrifices. "Your Highness," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with emotion, "you didn't need to come all this way for an old woman like me." But Prince George shook his head with gentle determination. "Yes, we did," he replied firmly. "You've shared your husband with my family for 29 years. You've spent countless holidays alone, missed dinners together, and supported him through a career dedicated to protecting us. My great-grandmother always taught me that service deserves recognition, and your service deserves recognition too." Prince William and Catherine watched their son with amazement and pride as he continued to speak with Margaret, asking about her teaching career, her students, and her life with William. The boy's genuine interest and natural warmth quickly put Margaret at ease, and soon she was sharing stories and laughing despite her illness. When Prince George learned that Margaret had been forced to leave her teaching position due to her treatments, he turned to his father with that determined expression they had come to recognize. "Daddy, can we arrange for Mrs. Hayes to stay connected with her students somehow? Maybe through video calls or letters? She misses them, and I bet they miss her too." The suggestions kept coming throughout their visit, each one demonstrating Prince George's growing understanding that true leadership meant paying attention to details that mattered to people's lives. He asked about Margaret's comfort, her medical needs, and her concerns about the future, treating each worry as something deserving of royal attention and assistance. As the afternoon drew to a close, Prince George made an announcement that surprised everyone present, including his parents. "Mrs. Hayes," he said formally, I want you to know that your husband is being granted special leave to spend as much time with you as you need. His position and pension are completely secure, and he should never worry about choosing between his duty to us and his love for you. William, who had been standing quietly to the side throughout the visit, finally broke down completely. 29 years of stoic service crumbled as he realized that his loyalty and sacrifice had been not only recognized, but rewarded with the greatest gift possible: time with his beloved Margaret. The next morning, William submitted his resignation from the Queen's Guard, but not because he was forced to choose between duty and love. Instead, he resigned because a 10-year-old prince had shown him that true honor sometimes requires accepting help, and that the greatest service he could now provide was to spend Margaret's remaining days showing her how much their life together had meant to him. Prince George's gesture created ripples throughout the royal household, inspiring new policies for supporting staff during family crises, and establishing a precedent for recognizing the personal sacrifices made by those who serve the crown. But more importantly, it demonstrated that compassion and leadership could exist together, and that sometimes the most powerful thing a future king can do is simply notice when someone needs help and have the courage to provide it. Margaret lived for 6 more months, and every day was spent with William by her side, both of them knowing that their love story had been honored by royalty in the most meaningful way possible. When she passed peacefully the following spring, Prince George attended her funeral, standing beside William as the guard said goodbye to the woman who had shared him with a grateful nation for nearly 3 decades.